we also classified in a peculiar way, were originated only by, sorry, there are people waiting. Originated by producer mainly, and those situations in particular in which the decreasing cost function of a whole sector of the economy, which is generally called the industry or district, because of reciprocal external effect, is able both to increase the potentiality of decreasing cost function of the whole sector in the long term, and generating a sort of attraction towards other producers, for instance, other firms, so as to become an important trigger of the economic system. And the health market, this situation is very important for polyclinic or high quality service or very specialized inside a center, which it is in general composed of different branches. Well, we could call them firm, but that's not the appropriate term. Now, what happens in this situation? We notice that given the, in some case, the high quality of the service is potentially related to very high initial cost for the investment that in general turn out to be sunk cost, which means those costs that cannot be recovered if the activity of the firm switches to something different. And for instance, if the leader of the first firm that makes the investment is not followed by others, there is a role for the government. And what we are going to see today is exactly which kind of role the government might play in this situation. I think last time we noticed the main ingredients for today's lecture is, I remind you, the role of subsidy, which is an important instrument in the hand of government, together with tax, excise tax. And the other bit of the story that you have to know before starting is the meaning of the gross consumer surplus, which, just to remind you, which is something that we are going to use today in order to see the kind of government intervention in situation in which we have a whole industry who altogether presents average cost in the long term, which are decreasing, which means a situation of potential natural monopoly. Whatever is the demand, the costs are decreasing. And we shall explore this situation referring to the concept of a consumer surplus, which, just to remind you what it is the situation. I don't remember if I was using the same, I'm using the same notation of last lecture. So assume that we have a consumer demand, PQ, and two quantity, Q0, 2, and Q1. And we want to know the utility of the consumer passing from a consumption of the good Q0 to a consumption of the good Q1. Now, what we are doing to capture the utility, the monetary utility of this consumption, this increase of consumption, delta Q, is found with the integral from Q0 to Q1 which is this area in red. And this integral, this bit, is called the gross consumer surplus, which is potentially the monetary utility that the consumer enjoys when it switches from a consumption equal to Q0 to a consumption equal to Q1. Now, assume that it also means that when it was in Q0, its willingness to pay was P0, and when it passes to Q1, its willingness to pay was P1. So, if you now assume that this consumer is able to purchase the amount Q1 minus Q0, which is delta Q, this distance, at a price equal to P1, what is spent for these goods is equal to the product of delta Q by the price that you find in the market. So if it spends all this amount here, which is the rectangle that represents this product, what remains to the consumer is the gross consumer surplus minus, which is the overall utility that they can get from the consumption of the good, minus what is really spent, and what remains to the consumers is this area in red. Okay, this is what we will see. We have already seen last time, so the net consumer surplus is given. Consumer surplus is given by the difference between the integral Q0 from Q0 to Q1 minus the consumer expenditure for the good. 1 minus Q0 times P prime, okay, which is this area. Now, why do we need this? Because the theorem that in a way explains the amount of the subsidy is related to what to be sustainable in the long run is related to the amount of money that the government can spend for if it wants to give an incentive to this industry, to this district or whatever, to this hospital, in order to guarantee is the maintenance of reciprocal external effect of the industry. So now we look at the situation I was talking about. You have all the ingredients. And yeah, we are The departing point is a situation like this. We refer to, say, Policlinico Umberto I, which is an excellence for hospitalization, high quality doctors, high average, high quality level in all the different branches. Notice that this is a quite good example because overall the hospital is a kind of district, exactly like that Marshall mentioned when he was thinking to this theorem, which means that you can find inside the whole polyclinic different branches which are individually not in the position of having decreasing cost function, but overall the average cost function of all the polyclinic is decreasing, which means that there might be external effect that you already know because we mentioned that. So we are in a situation in which the supply function SS prime is at a path in yellow, is decreasing, and is cut the demand function from below. So the demand function is the D, this one. Notice that in this situation, the consumer surplus from the polyclinic, say, is given by the area given by all the yellow area here, all the area below the demand function for this good or services provided by the firm, by the industry, which present an average cost function in the long term, which is equal to SS prime. Okay. Now what happens is a situation quite simple, and if we have to find a market equilibrium stable in the long term, we have to equalize supply and demand. And so at point P, we have more or less the equilibrium, which means that in this context, the quantity of good provided is equal to 0G, and it should be sold at the price of 0G, this one. Nothing new. Now, in the context that we mentioned, it might be also possibly to exploit the external effect generated by the decreasing cost function because it is considered a sort of trigger for development or can be of some interest for the collectivity. And how the government can do this. One way, as we see, was to subsidize the firms belonging to this district. And for instance, government could use a specific subsidy, which means that it gives to the whole industry, say, S euros for each unit that the sector produces of the good considered. What happens? How does the situation changes in this case? It's something like this. So the beginning, our beginning story was with this demand and this cost function. Long-term equilibrium is here at point P. Now, the government decided to give a subsidy equal to small s, this one, for each quantity of the good that is produced. And what is the effect of the subsidy, specific subsidy on the industry? The perception at the level of the whole industry is that the average cost curve is shifted downward in a parallel way, parallel to the original curve. So we pass, I call in this picture, I call the SS is the original one, S prime is the supply function after the subsidy has been given to the industry. Okay, so the new one is that I am marking in blue, and how the story changes. Now, given that the whole industry perceived a reduced average cost, the equilibrium is shifted to point T. I think it used to be a T here. And how much it costs to the government, that is, or this story, can you see it? The cost for the government of subsidize the industry with a subsidy, unit subsidy equal to S, which is constant for each unit of the good which is produced. The government spends S euros for each quantity of the good. So if I multiply S times the quantity, the new quantity at the equilibrium, I obtain is the area in green, which is the cost for government for having subsidized this district. Okay. Now, notice that there is a quite a nice situation for consumer, because at the beginning, the consumer surplus was this orange area. Here, I call it A, CB. So this was at the beginning the net consumer surplus as given by the difference between the gross consumer surplus for a quantity equal to G, which was the integral between 0 and G of the demand curve, less the amount paid by consumers, which is the area that I mark in which color? This one. 0 G P G. So the gross consumer surplus was 0 A P G. The consumer expenditure, I write it down. Gross, no, just color the bottom. The gross consumer surplus at the beginning, at the initial equilibrium, was equal to 0 A P G. The consumer expenditure for the good, which was, by the way, equal to the total cost for the firm, was equal to the area 0 GP. So the net consumer surplus given by the difference between the gross consumer surplus less consumer expenditure is equal to the orange area, which is GAP. Okay, this was the situation at the beginning. Now, the government has decided to subsidize all the firms belonging to this industry, and to this industry, a subsidy equal to S, this distance. And the expenditure for government gov expenditure is equal to the area C, capital C, T, P prime R. Okay, the green area. This is what the government spends for paying the subsidy, the unit subsidy equal to S for each quantity produced by the firms belonging to this sector. Now, if you were a consumer in this market, were you happy with it? Would you like this situation in which you passes from the consumption of G, of a quantity of the good equal to G at the price GP, to a quantity equal to H at the price HT? Would you like it? Is a situation that you would prefer, or you would actually prefer to stay as you were before? Notice that you are a potential patient of the polyclinic. And after this government action, you are in the position of consuming a bigger amount of the good at a lower price. Would you like it or not?
Yes.
Yes. Anybody is against this measure? So you like it. Mainly, I think, I suggested that you would like if someone else in the collectivity would pay the subsidy for the government. Remind that the government that decide to finance this kind of operation as a cost, which is given to this area, to the green area here. So it's not free for everybody. So the government gives money to the polyclinic. Nevertheless, the government itself has to pay the amount of money, for instance, by deciding, by taxing all the collectivity or by using public debt. But if you were patient of this hospital, you were more happy that the cost of this operation was shared among all the collectivity instead of asking you for a charge for repaying the subsidy. I think it's reasonable. You think so? Does anybody agree on this measure, on my consideration of consumer behavior in this situation? So the government gives money to the polyclinic in order to allow a bigger amount of production at a lower price. And the money the government gives to the hospital are paid by all the Italian population. And from the point of view of the consumer of the Roman polyclinic, this is very good because they are not expected to pay. Possibly a bit of their taxation is increased after this measure, but not so much, and possibly much lower than the real expenditure. Now, would you be happy if the same measure of this cost, the green cost, would be financed by you who are patient of that specific hospital? Would you like that measure? It's not so good, but you are economists, so you are expected to know whether this measure of financing from the government is still a good measure for the collectivity, even if we now ask the collectivity to pay, ask the collectivity who wants that good to pay for that good. What would you do? So we are not talking about dictatorship. So we are talking about democratic system where the collectivity is asked to decide, or there is a kind of participation on government decisions. So the government make a choice depending on what the collectivity wants. And this is a very democratic. So if you were required to pay for this measure, what would you do? Would you still want this measure or not? You are asked to answer, just making a rational consumer evaluation of the measure. You are the potential patient who were important for this demand function, which is however limited to those in the area of the benefits fall out, so inside the district. And you are asked to pay personally, if you want it, well, you pay the subsidy. Will you still want the subsidy if it's not shared among all the Italian population? Any idea? What would you do? Of course, the cost, the individual cost is higher, but is it still convenient?
It depends.
Depends on what?
If the price is higher than what I was paying before, then I would not take it.
You are expected, being an health economist, and so also an economist, to understand whether it is convenient or not by looking at, by evaluating the cost and demand.
Yes, but if I have to pay more and I'm not going to demand so much of healthcare, then I will not take the new offer, because I would not need extra quantity of going to the hospital.
I'm not sure I understood. So what you are saying is that, but assume that we have a way to, no, the price is reduced with respect to the original situation. It's clearly reduced given that the supply function is decreasing. But still, you are asked to pay something. Consider that the demand function is the aggregate demand. But we can, in the position of discriminating. Any other idea on how to measure the potential advantages or disadvantages of this kind of operation from an economic point of view? Well, look, I didn't mention just by chance the consumer surplus at the beginning. So the reason why I mentioned it is that we should use it in order to see what is monetary gain of consumers in this specific situation. And so we should analyze this new position, this new equilibrium by looking at the potential gain that this collectivity might have after the reduction of prices. So what happens if we have a new equilibrium at point, I cannot see the blackboard, at point T, in terms of consumer surplus. Can you see it? So this is what happened before. No, this is the expenditure. This is that. And this is start. Is what happens before the subsidy. We had at the beginning a net consumer surplus equal to C, small c, A, P. Okay, what happens now? If I pass it with this maneuver, I pass from an equilibrium on T. Here. Have a look at what happens at the gross consumer surplus. It is, this is before, I call it B, 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 and B. And this is the gross consumer surplus after the subsidy. And it is equal to 0, A, T, H. Okay, the integral from 0 to H of the demand function in this interval. So we have 0, A, T, H. So in the absence of, without considering the subsidy, the consumer expenditure in this situation would be, I call it 3x after, at the price equal to TH is equal to the price times the quantity of H. So it's equal to the rectangle that I'm marking in blue, this rectangle here. So it is equal to 0H T capital C. Okay. So the subsidy is still, the government expenditure for the subsidy is still the same. What we need now, we need the net consumer surplus after the subsidy. Which is given by the difference between the gross consumer surplus after subsidy and the consumer expenditure after the subsidy, which is equal to C, T, A. So what I have done is the difference between all this area which is the gross consumer surplus, less the consumer expenditure, which is equal to the area that I'm marking in black, this. Okay, so now the difference is visible because we have a quite relevant increase in the consumer surplus because it passes from, what was it first? Small CAP to capital CTA. So it's quite big. We have all this area, which is the delta subsidy, the delta consumer net consumer surplus, which is given by the area G, T, P, small c. Okay, this one. I'm going to delete everything after that because I'm not. Okay, so the increase of consumer surplus is all the black area that I found here. This occurs in front of a government expenditure which is equal to the green area, this one. So, what can you see now? Do you still have doubt on making or not this maneuver? Or it is better to stay at equilibrium P? Is it convenient? The gain is the black area. C, capital C, P prime, no, sorry, capital C, T, P, small c. This is the gain, the delta net consumer surplus after the maneuver. This, we have this advantage in front of a government expenditure which is equal to capital C, T, P prime, R. So do you want this measure or not? If you are expected to pay the government expenditure, is it convenient? You say yes. Any idea if it is convenient? I clean it up in the meantime. We have the green area, I would be precise. Versus the advantage, which is the red area. So if the consumer, this consumer, are expected to pay an amount equal to the expenditure for government, for the subsidy, no, you are the consumer. Do you want this measure now that you see the advantages versus the disadvantages? Someone doesn't want the measure here. You said yes or no. He does want, she doesn't want. Any idea? Well, look, it's a decision which is important for you. Is it convenient for the consumer to have their access to this good or service, whatever? So, in my understanding, in spite of this voice, the law, I understood that he said that the gain is bigger than the expenditure, which is almost clear in this situation. So if I ask to this consumer to pay, you can see that a relevant amount of the expenditure is covered by the former gain of the subsidy. There is a small part that the triangle, oh, there is no letter, I put here letter, it is a letter Z. There is this triangle Z, P prime T, which is outside the consumer surplus. But if I'm good enough to make a subsidy such that the area of this triangle is this black area is equal to this area. If I ask to those consumers to pay for the subsidy, and they do it, they still remain with the gain, net gain, monetary gain, equal to the yellow area. So it is convenient to do it. Is that clear? So, but at one point, is to determine the amount of the subsidy, because that is very important for different reasons that we will also see later on. But it is called a theorem, Marshall theorem on decreasing industries, because the point that I have an industry with decreasing cost is not enough to say that in any case I have to give them a subsidy, and it is also always convenient for consumers. Why? Because it might be not sustainable, the situation. For instance, if this meant a story like this, in which ceteris paribus, the demand was of this, the origin was in G. Look, the amount of the subsidy chosen maybe would not be nice for consumers. Why? Because if exactly in this situation in which the origin of the story is G instead of H, so forget this part. And I make the same measure with the same amount of the subsidy. As you can see, well, I increase the quantity of the good provided, okay? But what happens is that if I'm asking to the consumer to pay for that measure, they don't have any consumer surplus, because this is exactly, is covered exactly by the net consumer surplus. So they remain without surplus. And then I say, well, possibly it's better to do something else. So the point is how big must be the subsidy, and the amount of the subsidy must be valid in any situation. For instance, for a smaller, for a different situation, say that we consider the origin from here. This situation works because the consumer is left with an amount of subsidy, with an amount of net consumer surplus, which makes the measure acceptable and feasible in the economy without using the public budget. This is the first point. So the first point is related to the amount of subsidy that the government must decide to give to the firms, and it should be considered by evaluating the situation in which consumers of that specific industry are required to pay for the subsidy, and evaluating, and by evaluating whether they still want the measure in all situations. And the point that the subsidy must be small enough to recreate the situation makes the use of the subsidy always useful in these cases. A second important point is for how long. This is a static analysis, as you see. They are long-term cost for the industry, but it is considered just now. This is the picture now. And one point, well, a very important point is for how long the government should give this subsidy to this industry. Because we say that it is good to give a subsidy because other than improving the consumer surplus, increasing the consumer surplus, as we can see in this situation, the fact that the government is subsidizing this peculiar industry means that other firms can enjoy this district and exploit the various advantages. But for how long it is sustainable? Or does it mean that it should be replicated to infinity? The answer is possibly no. And it should be, given the situation, it should be enough to trigger the system and let people exploiting the external diseconomy, the supplier exploited the supplier external economies, so adding to the sector and possibly also developing the country, but considering the point that we have not considered yet, that in the presence of subsidy, a peculiar sector of the economy, whatever it is, becomes attractive. And if we are moving inside a monopoly situation, natural monopoly situation, it might be that a number of positive external economies that we have at the beginning transform themselves in negative economy. Why? Because, for instance, a number on non-required firms are attracted and join this economic sector in a way that makes those that at first we evaluated positively as reciprocal external economies and negative economies. Why? Because, for instance, attracting the number of people, number of firms in a given area that is not, might not be sustainable by the areas themselves. Or, for instance, because pollution or traffic might not be sustainable by that area. Sapienza is now studying, there is a center for it, the impact of the hospitals and all the center present, we are present in Rome, the impact of them in the metropolitan area, exactly analyzing whether, well, the effect of the first thing that has been used, that has been considered, is related to the emergency situation in which, in a metropolitan area like Rome, different centers spread all over the metropolis are difficult to be reached by people living in different areas of Rome, which possibly were developed, I mean, those areas, simply because of the attraction of whatever, not necessarily hospital. But what is the problem in a situation of a metropolitan area in which there are different hospitals, which are district in our language, in the Martial language, and which are high quality district, where the best of different specialization are concentrated for people living in a different part of the town. Can you see it? So if, for instance, if there is an emergency, how much the traffic or congestion of traffic jam impedes the patient who needs the emergency to reach the center that would be the appropriate for his disease. And this might be a problem. Or the point that even in the presence of a number of polyclinics in Rome, I specialized for everything. The point, the problem of the list to access the service, which are not guaranteed so easily because The high quality also possibly determines high demand given the population. So how long is the waiting list before your access is guaranteed? All these bit of the stories are strictly related to damages of monopoly. We saw as the first damage of the monopoly the fact that there is a bad monopolist, which is not very nice with people, so is in the position of maximizing the profit. So choosing a price is the only one present, choosing a price which is quite high and is really producing a low quantity. So in a way, rationing the amount of goods and services provided. We are in the presence, for instance, in the metropolitan area of Rome, we are in presence of a kind of monopolistic competition, which is a situation in which, well, there is not just one, but a group of hospitals who might use the same rules, but they are not only bad people that act in order to get their rents. It might be also, there might be also a problem of incentive to quality when you are a monopolist. So for how long the different hospitals subsidized by government in a situation which is attractive both for firms, other hospital or specialized people working for the main branch arise and join it, thus increasing the demand for that good. It became a sort of congestion of all the area in which they are. So what at the beginning were reciprocal external positive effect of the existence of decreasing cost function might become, if the situation does not allow, a negative external reciprocal effect that should be avoided, which is also a different reason about the containment of the subsidy in all those cases in which we are in front of this situation. Another part that I just mentioned, but very quickly, is related to the fact that which kind of production of supply we should have in this situation, mainly if we think of health system, health economics, not in general of a whole industry, because I don't know if I mentioned that, but you can think of an industry like the automotive industry, which is an example. But for instance, Hollywood is a district for cinema and movie production. Or Cinecittà is a quite important district for production of movie and the like, and now mainly television program. I don't know, in different parts of Italy, some district can be recognized in different, the most strange activities like silk production in the region of Como used to be an important district for the Made in Italy and the like. So we have a variety of situations in which we can recognize the importance of this theorem. But when we talk about health and the possibility of exploiting the decreasing cost function, one point is that of guaranteeing the high quality of the system, of the production, which makes, independent of the subsidy, the role of government quite important as a guarantee of the service. Why? Because as it definitely happens in the northern Italy, where the system is much more than in the center of Italy, mixed with a stronger production of health goods and services occurring by part of the private sector, and we have a number of clinic or hospital which are private in a sense, who have received subsidy from the government or are under the control of the minister, but they are still a private entity. What could happen in this situation is that, and increase the role of government, is that they might at a certain point reduce the interest of invest in quality and innovation, simply because they know that their market still works even in the absence of huge investment in research, for instance. And so at a certain point, that part of the economic situation that makes that investment interesting and also profitable from the point of view even of a private sector becomes a sort of regular market in which quality is not longer pursued as a good point, or whether innovation is not more relevant as it used to be before. Another important thing that could happen is that related to the peculiarity of the service, goods and services provided by this entity, at least by some branch of them. Because which kind of economic incentive might I find if I'm specialized on rare disease? If there is no incentive from government, but not even those kind of analysis or solution is even provided in those parts of Italy in which the private sector is working. Because what happens in Lombardy, for instance, and it emerged very strongly during the pandemic, was that, well, there is a strong private sector, provided most of the specialized goods and services that can be required by the population. But those who are rare and very expensive are always because there is no convenience to make an hospital for. I'm not an expert of the kind of disease which are very rare, very expensive, which requires an amount of money for research, and where the cure is also very expensive. So which can be the incentive for a private firm to provide this good? So the piece of market that they want to enter, they are private, is only that which is mainly remunerative, which means from the point of view of patient, a kind of exclusion from the system if you have not that kind of disease that it please that to the private firm. So as for the external diseconomies of production or of provision of the goods, as for the classification, I don't want to repeat, but the kind is more or less the kind of classification that we can make is more or less the same as before, as that we did for positive. Oh, sorry, how long it was in waiting? Well, I didn't look at this. It can be done. I was saying that the kind of classification of negative external economies is exactly the same that we use for those positive. In most cases, the treatment is also the same. And what the kind of external economies which are important are those generated by a kind of production that might lead the government to intervene to reduce the damage of the monopoly. In that case, even in the presence of decreasing cost function, wherever the external effect of monopolies, of a monopolistic competition, it doesn't matter if there is only one monopolist or more than one in a given area, can be exactly the opposite. So at a certain point, the subsidy, even in the presence of decreasing costs, because we are in a situation of unnatural monopoly, subsidy should stop. And sometimes, if the overall environment is not in the position of standing this situation, we might use the mirror image of the subsidy, which means taxation, in order to contain and imposing a sort of rationing of the good provided. Notice also that we have a problem when we talk of government intervention, money in the health sector, because the intervention in the health sector with monopolistic characteristics can occur in two main institutional forms. One is that government is that one in which government nationalized the firm or the industry. I continue to call industry in order to be more general than I can. So it means that it changes the juridic nature of the firms and makes it public. So the state became the owner and managed the firm. This is one way, it's called nationalization. And it's a practice that government in Italy at least used for quite a long time in last century policy. When it was considered for a number of public utilities, and also for health, even before then the national reform, which occurred in Italy in 1978. He, in a way, decided to nationalize the firm. He became the owner and directly managed the industry and makes all his policy as he could. But what happens the second option is that of leaving the private firm managing and owning the firm or the industry, but in a way regulating the market so as to guarantee that patients in this case have the access at certain price, possibly contained price, to the good. So they are alternative situation in the market for health. For instance, that of regulation is very often used in the United States. After the reform in Italy, one strong action was that of nationalization of the existing structure, which became public, and they are in most cases they are still public. Which is the point with this latter form of public intervention, which is nationalization? What we find is something that changes completely the nature of the structure that is managed by government. That is, by being a firm, like or a group of firms that used the market rules after nationalization, it became public and it's becoming a kind of bureaucratic organization for which not always the market rules might work. Moreover, being the government itself managing the manager of the firm, it might well happen that there is a kind of artificial tendency to monopoly that is due to the fact that, well, we have a government, the government, which is acting as monopolist, is in the position of making its own purchasing policies. So it might mean that the purchases are not so convenient after a certain point. Because if you think of the situation of some regions in Italy, where the region is the purchaser of last distance in most cases, and might act as monopolistic in most cases, mainly in the south of Italy, it might well happen that the purchasing prices are not so convenient or in a way regulated, increased with respect to the market prices, which is a situation that quite often can occur. The other point is still that, and no, sorry, I didn't finish, and moreover, becoming a bureaucratic public monopolist might also mean that after a certain point, all the costs, even those that justified the switch from a private firm to a public firm, increase simply because there is not longer the competitive system or anyway the market system that act as a sort of control with respect to the behavior of the management, the public management of the firm. So I think you know now all the point related to failure on the supply side. In the last bit of the lecture, I want to finish the part, at least the part related to external effect, by considering also the external effect, positive or negative, which are determined by consumer habits. This bit of the lecture, even if in a way allow me to end with part related to external effect, shall be considered again when we shall consider those who are called market failure on the demand side. But before talking about market failure of the demand side and also merit goods, which are the consequent issue, we have to talk about the external effect generated by consumption, which in this case are this bit of the picture. So we have some situation in which the consumer habits are such that determines positive or negative effect on either other consumers. The external effect goes from the consumer activities to another consumer activities, or from a consumer activity to production. There are quite important cases of it. One some are very well known. Possibly you have already read those in the handbook, in the book you have already considered. The first exam, for instance, the external effect from consumption activity is smoking. If I smoke, I damage other people who are around me, because so I'm producing an external effect which is not regulated by prices, for instance, where the cost here in mine of work, or another situation of consumption activity that produces external effect on other is that, for instance, I have a garden with peaceful by other people passing close to my house, and I make it so beautiful, so that all those people who passes, at least in the area from which my garden can be seen, have received a positive external effect. Well, then it might, it looks a small thing, but if you consider that the impact of environment now, it might be also important, but there are also some external effect from consumption that possibly you have not already thought of. For instance, why did you decide to study health economics? On what is my reason, or why you? Which is your degree, undergraduate degree of provenance? Where are you from? So we begin from here. Your degree. Here from this faculty. Which? Shut up. No, but you should shut because I'm deaf. Senza capello, la mia studente. Let's go.
Me, European political sciences.
From?
From France, Lille.
Lecce.
Lecce.
I did pharmacy in Turkey.
Turkey. So, what is the main motivation for your choice? So you should have already answered to most of the things I've told. Why you didn't? You forgot everything. So this is not. It's quite disappointing. So why did you choose whatever? The main motivation for choosing your first degree university?
Because I knew that Sapienza is a very good university, and I wanted to study abroad, and health economics was a subject that I'm very passionate, and I wanted to have a good formation on this subject, very technical.
Any other motivation? No, not exactly for health, but the point is your choice was driven by something that was related mainly to your objective aims for future or not? Or it is a quite difficult, quite important choice, because possibly means that you can be of help to someone else. Did you think of it, or possibly you think, well, if I become a quite good health economist, I will make lots of money? It might be. Or I want to go in Africa and Ukraine and help all those people suffering. Whatever is the reason, but I don't think it's the second. the point is that independent of your wishes, and you are thinking of doing a job that you like, I think it's generally the most common the reason for choosing something. The point is that when you just simply have a university degree, your choice affects the social welfare of the collectivity in which you live. Because it has been shown that there is a quite strong correlation between the amount of people having a undergraduate or graduate degree in a population and the amount of GDP growth of that population. So whatever you do, just because you study and reach your first degree, undergraduate degree, or master degree, or doctoral degree, or whatever, the level of growth of a country is quite often related to the degree of education of the population of that country. So, and this is quite independent. I don't think that any of you have chosen to study just because it was increasing the GDP of a country. Did you? It was not a mind motivation. Possibly you were more careful when you consider the fact that being vaccinated can make the difference in presence of a pandemic, but even that is a matter of external effect of choosing prevention. You possibly, if you were free, in most cases, people would like to be vaccinated simply because they fear of a possible disease, infectious disease, which is also contagious, and they don't want, and being free, just don't think of anything else. But it has been shown that the herd effect leave out the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, which is leave it out. But if you think of all those kind of contagious diseases that fortunately enjoy of what is called the effect, when you choose to be vaccinated and all the population reaches a given threshold that might be different depending on the kind of disease, there is a kind of a positive external effect for the whole population, given that that disease doesn't spread simply because there is sort of barrier that is determined by the fact that a quite enough high number of population has been vaccinated. It doesn't work like this with COVID because of the variants, but in principle it works like that. In in this case, in most and some of these cases, the possibility of generating external effects on other individuals of the collectivity in which people we are considering are generated can be studied with the standard way of economists, more or less as before we mentioned the use of subsidy or the use of excise taxes. It still works. It works because the individual rationally choose to consume something which is rational to consume, but it's not said that they want to have a rational behavior. And in so doing, they generate external effect on others. And in case they are positive, they might receive some incentive. For instance, I could incentivize individual to choose to be vaccinated in the presence of contagious disease in different way. For instance, by providing vaccines for free. This is a standard. Or penalizing individuals who do not want to be vaccinated in different ways if it works. So in in a number of situations, we have, or even the story, all the external effects related to education can be in a way forced by public action. If I know that at least a certain threshold is useful for a country to be reached because it increases the possibility of development for that country, I can in a way subsidize young people to go to school, for instance, by guaranteeing them with a reduced amount of fees to be paid, which is a form of subsidy for that students, or penalizing those, if we are talking about education, compulsory education for young, very young, for children. I can penalize parents who are not, do not put in the position their own children to go to school, because at least the compulsory education must be as such guaranteed, is guaranteed for free, at least in Italy. And everybody should decide to that the children, not they should decide, they are not allowed to decide, they are, it is compulsory in Italy at least, that up to a certain age they have to go to school. And this is a decision that would penalize even heavily those parents who don't want their children to go to school. It happens even in Italy, and there is an enormous amount of illiteracy that is quite, which is due not to the fact that the schools are not good enough, but to the fact that parents don't want their children to go to school. So the way for treating external effect, either positive or negative, might be exactly the same as those that we mentioned when we consider the production of external effect by the supply side. What changes in case of external effect from consumption is the fact that sometimes the main motivation that determines the generation of external effect by part of consumer, which are those rational, might not work properly if individuals are left alone. And we know, because I mentioned you at the beginning, is that there are individuals that either for goods that do produce positive effect on other individuals of the community, but even for those goods, which are not goods, by the way, which are simply bads, they are not so well rationally motivated to either consume or not to consume that kind of good. So determining a kind of external effect even on those of the collectivity who are living with that. And this introduces the point of merit good, where we are going to stop here, because before talking about merit good, you have to know the black with global public good that Professor Giuliato will explain in the next two lectures. But we are in a situation in which the rationality of consumer does not work properly, mainly if we are taking decisions which are related to a dynamic context. So I can also assume that if I take one-shot decision about the consumption or not, individuals are simply rational and they do what is better for them, whatever it is. There are a number of situations in which, even if well informed, or even if they know whatever, they do not make the best decision that they can, which means, and this originates two different goods which are quite important for health, which are merit good. Please don't look, in case I read what is written in the material that I mentioned, and it still is in Moodle. Don't look in the web when you want to know what is merit good. What you will find is something that, well, a merit good as the standard answer in the web is that is something that the state decides that is something good to be consumed. So it gives a merit. And this is something that can be done either in a democratic system or in a totalitarian system. For instance, when the current Russia system was that of the Soviet Union, and there was not a proper market, but there was a planner at the center. The planner was in the position of deciding what is good for the population. The same occurred in the China of Mao Zedong, where the government was in the position of deciding that dressing in a certain way, eating certain things was what was good for the population, and every good that is in the market, sold by the market, was supplied by the government, and any good supplied by the government was very good. What we are talking about is now a situation in which the individual who normally uses the market and takes rationally its own decision is in the position of taking decision which for some goods are not the correct one. Why? Because they are called time inconsistent, which means that I'm taking today, I'm planning today for consuming in a certain way. I'm an optimizer consumer, so I maximize my utility over time, knowing my habits and my income and my preferences. But what I'm deciding today, although I'm rational, is not the best I can do. And who says that it's not the best if I myself, I'm deciding what I'm doing, is the fact that once the situation, my choice is realized, it means ex post, after the decision is taken, I noticed that the decision I have taken was not the correct one. And so there is a kind of inconsistency between the ex post results with my ex ante decision, which makes the situation quite difficult. These issues which are related to different motivation that can be reconciled or when I become old, but now I don't know exactly what that being old means. So my decision in the future would be not good enough. And this approach is in the position of those who are called merit good, but also those who are not called, those who are called the merit good or bad. And the branch of the health economic system is known as health economic of paths. What do I mean? It's a specular situation of the good stories I mentioned about vaccination, about education, where individuals choosing, they are fully rational, they choose and make their choice thinking of the best for them. Now, we have fully rational individuals because we assume that individuals are fully rational, at least to to know which kind of choices we can find in the market. But we decide, for instance, to consume bats, which are commodities, we are dangerous for health. And what is the reason? Clearly, this is a time inconsistent decision. I know perfectly personally because I'm an heavy smoker. And I know that this is very dangerous. No, not sure it is very dangerous. But anyway, I continue to smoke independent of all my disease, cardiac disease, blood disease, or whatever. I continue to smoke 3 packets a day, 2, 3 packets a day. Very heavy smokers. And possibly when a number of, I don't know, of years, I will say, well, possibly that was not a good choice when I decided to continue to smoke, even knowing that, but I still taking it, I'm still continuing to do that. And the economics of bats, even more than a very good situation, is quite important for health because it generates in all kind of institutional system for health and institutional system for states. It generates very expensive situation for the health system, and which the point that we shall consider are related to specific bats, which are tobacco, alcohol, gaming, junk food, all those things that people consume that are dangerous for health, and drugs, sorry, after most easy to be reminded. And they are so not so dangerous, so expensive that the OECD has declared that kind of disease a problem for most of the countries of the OECD, which are a number quite high. That's not the whole number of the country existing in the world, but the problem is quite easy. It's quite different also between countries because sometimes, for instance, for alcohol, it depends on the latitude of the countries. Northern countries suffer more for alcohol problem with respect to the southern one, but it is still problem for different national health system that we are going to consider. So we shall continue all this discussion on merit goods and bad goods and bad. I never remember not add good to bad because it's oxymoron. But anyway, we shall talk about it immediately after the story of global public goods. Okay, have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Prof. Bye.
Bye-bye.